Admiral Thomas had spent most of his life serving his country. He had traveled across the world, led missions, and earned the respect of those who served under him. After months away from home, he finally had the chance to return. Tired but content, he arrived at the airport, ready for a peaceful flight. His ticket was for first class, a small luxury he had allowed himself after years of hard work. As he walked through the busy terminal, people rushed past him, lost in their own travel plans. He didn't mind. He had been in much more chaotic situations before. The airport was nothing compared to the challenges he had faced at sea. With his carry-on bag in hand, he approached the gate, handed over his boarding pass, and received a polite nod from the airline staff. "Enjoy your flight, sir," the attendant said with a smile. Boarding the plane, he quickly found his seat in first class. The large, comfortable chair was a welcome sight after months of military bunks and long hours on duty. He placed his bag in the overhead compartment, sat down, and exhaled deeply, already looking forward to some much-needed rest. As the other first-class passengers boarded, the atmosphere was calm. People settled into their seats, flipping through magazines or adjusting their pillows. Just as Thomas was about to close his eyes, he heard a sharp voice from the aisle. "Excuse me, miss, I think there's been a mistake," a woman's voice said. Thomas turned his head slightly and saw a woman standing a few feet away. She was dressed in expensive clothes, her jewelry sparkling under the cabin lights. Her expression was a mix of disbelief and irritation as she spoke to the flight attendant. "I'm supposed to be sitting here," she continued, pointing toward Thomas's seat. "I don't know why he's here, but this is first class, and I paid good money for my ticket." The flight attendant glanced at her tablet, checking the seat assignments. "Ma'am, your seat is actually just over there," she said politely, pointing to the row across from Thomas. The woman frowned, her eyes narrowing as she looked at him again. "Are you sure? That doesn't make sense. Are you telling me he's sitting in first class?" Thomas didn't react. He had seen this kind of attitude before, people who judged others without knowing anything about them. He had learned long ago that it was better to stay calm in such situations. "Yes, ma'am," the flight attendant confirmed. "He has a valid first-class ticket." The woman crossed her arms and let out a small laugh, shaking her head as if she couldn't believe what she was hearing. "That's interesting," she muttered. Then, turning back to the flight attendant, she added, "Well, I'd like to speak to someone about this. I don't feel comfortable sitting here." A few passengers nearby had started to glance in their direction, sensing the tension. The flight attendant looked slightly nervous but kept her professional tone. "Ma'am, if there's an issue, I can call my supervisor." The woman sighed dramatically. "Yes, do that. I just want to make sure everything is correct." Thomas remained silent. He had spent his career handling much bigger problems than this. If she wanted to complain, that was her choice. He wasn't going to let it ruin his journey home. The flight attendant quickly stepped away to call her supervisor, leaving the woman standing in the aisle with an annoyed expression. Admiral Thomas remained calm in his seat, watching the situation unfold without saying a word. He had experienced far more stressful moments in his life, and this was nothing compared to the challenges he had faced during his service. A few passengers in first class exchanged glances, clearly aware of the tension. Some looked uncomfortable, while others pretended not to notice. The woman, however, didn't seem to care about the attention. She sighed loudly, tapping her fingers against her purse, as if waiting for someone to fix a mistake that had never happened. Moments later, the flight supervisor arrived, a middle-aged man with a calm but firm demeanor. "Good evening, ma'am. I understand there's a concern about your seat," he asked politely. "Yes," the woman replied, crossing her arms. "I was under the impression that first class was for people who actually belong here. I don't know how this happened, but I'd like to be seated away from him." She tilted her head toward Admiral Thomas without even looking at him directly. The supervisor frowned slightly, glancing at Thomas before checking the passenger list on his tablet. He spoke with a professional but firm tone. "Ma'am, I've reviewed the seating chart, and everything is correct. This gentleman has a valid first-class ticket, just like you. There is no mistake." The woman's face tightened, her lips pressing into a thin line. "I just don't feel comfortable sitting here," she insisted. "Isn't there another seat available? Maybe one where I won't have to deal with this situation." Thomas still didn't react. He had been in far more intense confrontations during his career. He knew that sometimes silence was the best response. The supervisor took a deep breath, clearly trying to remain patient. "Ma'am, if you are unhappy with your seat, we can check if there's another available, but I cannot remove another passenger from their rightful place." The woman scoffed, shaking her head in disbelief. "Unbelievable. So I'm just supposed to sit here and accept this," she muttered. The supervisor remained professional. "Ma'am, we treat all our passengers with respect, and we expect the same in return. If you choose not to take your assigned seat, we can see if there's an available seat in economy." At this, the woman's expression changed. "Excuse me. You're suggesting I move to economy?" she asked, clearly offended. The supervisor nodded. "That is the only option if you do not wish to sit here, but first class is full, and every passenger here has a right to their seat." The woman was speechless for a moment. She glanced around, realizing that everyone was watching her now. A few people had small smirks on their faces, clearly amused by how her plan had backfired. Admiral Thomas finally looked up, meeting her eyes with a calm but firm expression. He still hadn't said a word, but his quiet confidence spoke volumes. The woman shifted uncomfortably, realizing that she was not going to win this argument. With a dramatic sigh, she turned back to the flight supervisor. "Fine," she said, rolling her eyes. "I'll sit here. But I am not happy about this." The supervisor simply nodded and walked away, leaving her to settle into her seat, clearly irritated. Thomas, however, remained relaxed. He had seen enough in his life to know that actions always speak louder than words. The woman sat down in her seat with an annoyed expression, crossing her arms tightly. She kept glancing toward Admiral Thomas, as if she still couldn't believe he was sitting there. Her frustration was clear, but Thomas remained calm, focused on his own thoughts. He had dealt with many difficult situations in his life. This was just another moment he would brush off. The flight attendants continued preparing the cabin for takeoff, moving efficiently through their tasks. Meanwhile, the woman kept shifting in her seat, sighing loudly, as if trying to get someone to agree with her frustration. She even glanced at the other passengers, hoping to find support, but most people ignored her. After a few minutes, she turned to the flight attendant who was walking by and said, "Are you sure there's no way to fix this? I just don't feel comfortable." The flight attendant, maintaining a professional smile, replied, "Ma'am, we've already explained the seating situation. If you need anything else, please let us know." The woman let out a dramatic sigh. "I just don't understand how things like this happen," she muttered. Then, as if she had just come up with an idea, she leaned toward Thomas slightly and asked, "So, what do you do?" It was a simple question, but the way she asked it made it clear that she expected a certain kind of answer. She wanted confirmation that her assumptions about him were correct. Thomas turned his head slightly, meeting her gaze with a steady, calm look. He could tell what she was trying to do, but he wasn't going to entertain her game. "I work in the military," he said simply. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Oh, the military," she repeated, her tone making it clear that she wasn't impressed. "That's interesting." She paused, then added, "I guess that makes sense." Thomas didn't react. He knew she was fishing for a response, but he had nothing to prove to her. He had spent his entire career leading men and women through challenges that most people couldn't even imagine. He didn't need validation from someone like her. The woman smirked slightly, as if she had figured something out. "You must be, what, a sergeant or something?" she asked. A few passengers nearby glanced over, sensing the tension. Thomas remained calm, but there was a small shift in the air. Before he could answer, the pilot's voice came over the intercom. announcing final preparations for takeoff. The woman sighed again, leaning back in her seat, clearly thinking she had won some kind of battle. Thomas didn't say a word. He just looked ahead, knowing that soon enough she would learn exactly who she was sitting next to. The plane had started taxiing toward the runway, and the cabin crew was making final safety checks. Admiral Thomas sat quietly in his seat, his posture relaxed but his mind fully aware of everything around him. Years of military service had trained him to notice small details, body language, tone, and unspoken tension. The woman beside him still looked irritated, shifting in her seat as if she was deeply unhappy with how things had turned out. A few moments passed in silence before the woman spoke again. "You didn't answer my question," she said, glancing at him. Thomas looked at her calmly. "Which question?" he asked, even though he already knew what she meant. The woman crossed her arms. "What's your actual rank?" "You said you're in the military, but that could mean anything." She gave a small, dismissive shrug. "I mean, no offense, but I just don't see how someone like you gets to sit here." Thomas didn't react right away. He had faced far greater challenges than a rude comment on a plane. He wasn't offended. He was simply waiting for the right moment to respond. Before he could speak, there was a slight commotion near the front of the cabin. The flight attendants suddenly straightened up, and a man in a crisp pilot's uniform stepped out of the cockpit. He had a confident stride, but as soon as he scanned the first-class cabin, his eyes locked onto Thomas. For a brief second, the pilot looked surprised. Then, without hesitation, he walked straight toward Thomas with purpose. The woman beside him frowned, clearly confused. "Sir," the pilot said as he stopped beside Thomas's seat. His voice carried a tone of deep respect, and before anyone could understand what was happening, the pilot stood at attention and gave a crisp salute. "It's an honor to have you aboard, Admiral." The entire first-class cabin went silent. A few heads turned, passengers suddenly paying attention. The woman's eyes widened in shock. Admiral Thomas, still composed, gave a small nod in return. "Good to see you, Captain," he said calmly. "It's been a while." The pilot smiled, his respect clear. "Yes, sir. I had the privilege of serving under you years ago. You were one of the best leaders I've ever met. I still remember your lessons." The woman's mouth opened slightly, but no words came out. Her entire expression changed from arrogance to embarrassment. She glanced around, realizing that everyone in first class was now watching. The pilot continued. "If you need anything at all during this flight, Admiral, please don't hesitate to let me or the crew know." Thomas gave a slight smile. "I appreciate that, Captain, but I'm just a passenger today. No special treatment needed." The pilot nodded but still stood with deep respect. "Of course, sir. Welcome aboard." Then, with one last respectful glance, he turned and walked back toward the cockpit. Silence hung in the air for a moment. The woman beside Thomas sat frozen, her face turning red. She had spent the entire time assuming he didn't belong in first class, only to find out she had been sitting next to a high-ranking admiral, a man who had dedicated his life to serving his country. Thomas didn't say anything. He simply turned his gaze forward, letting the moment speak for itself. The cabin remained silent for a few moments after the pilot left. The other passengers, who had been pretending not to notice the situation before, were now openly watching. Some exchanged quiet whispers, while others simply looked impressed. The woman next to Admiral Thomas, however, sat stiffly in her seat, her face a mixture of embarrassment and shock. Her confidence from earlier had completely disappeared. She had spent so much time trying to prove that Thomas didn't belong in first class, only to find out she had been sitting next to a highly respected Navy admiral. It was clear that she didn't know what to do or say. For the first time since she had boarded, she was silent. She glanced at Thomas a few times, but he didn't even look at her. He remained calm, as if nothing had happened, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. A flight attendant walked by and paused next to him. "Sir, would you like anything to drink before takeoff?" she asked, her voice holding a new level of respect. Thomas gave a small nod. "Just water, please." The flight attendant quickly brought him a glass of cold water and placed it gently on his tray. "If you need anything at all, just let us know," she said with a polite smile. "Thank you," Thomas replied, his tone warm but reserved. The woman beside him fidgeted, clearly uncomfortable. She had gone from demanding he be moved to coach to realizing she was the one who had been completely wrong. Her earlier smugness was gone. She finally cleared her throat and turned slightly toward Thomas. I didn't know," she said awkwardly. Thomas remained calm, taking a slow sip of his water before placing the glass back down. He turned his head slightly, meeting her nervous gaze. "Didn't know what?" he asked, his voice steady. The woman swallowed, looking away for a brief moment. "I didn't know you were someone important," she admitted. Thomas raised an eyebrow. Would it have made a difference? She blinked, caught off guard by his question. I just mean, I wasn't trying to be rude," she said quickly, though even she didn't seem convinced by her own words. Thomas let a small pause settle between them before replying. "Respect isn't about knowing someone's title," he said simply. "It's about how you treat people, no matter who they are." The woman looked down, unable to respond. She knew he was right. The way she had acted earlier had nothing to do with his rank. It had been based on assumptions she had made without any real reason. And now, those assumptions had left her feeling foolish. A few passengers nearby, who had heard his words, nodded subtly in agreement. Thomas, however, didn't say anything more. He wasn't interested in making her feel bad. He simply wanted her to think about her actions. The plane continued taxiing toward the runway, and as the engines roared to life, the woman remained quiet, clearly deep in thought. As the plane gained speed down the runway, the woman sat still, her earlier confidence completely gone. The engines roared, and within moments, the aircraft lifted smoothly into the sky. The soft hum of the engines filled the cabin as the plane climbed higher, leaving the world below. Admiral Thomas remained calm, gazing out the window as the clouds passed by. He had spent years flying to different parts of the world. This was just another journey for him. But for the woman sitting beside him, it was clear this flight had turned into something very different from what she had expected. She glanced at Thomas a few times, as if trying to find the right words to say. Her fingers tapped nervously against the armrest, and she took a deep breath before finally speaking. I just want to say I'm sorry," she said, her voice quieter than before. Thomas turned his head slightly, looking at her with his usual calm expression. He didn't seem surprised by her words, but he also didn't rush to respond. He simply waited. The woman hesitated before continuing. "I shouldn't have judged you like that," she admitted. "I made assumptions without even knowing you. That was wrong." Thomas studied her for a moment, then nodded slightly. "I appreciate that," he said, his voice steady. She exhaled, looking relieved that he wasn't angry. "It's just, I guess sometimes people think they know everything about someone just by looking at them," she said, almost as if she was trying to explain her own mistake. Thomas gave a small smile, though it didn't hold any amusement, just understanding. "That happens a lot," he replied. "But life has a way of teaching us different lessons when we least expect them." The woman nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She glanced down at her hands, clearly embarrassed by how she had acted earlier. "I shouldn't have spoken to you that way," she admitted. "I was rude, and I see that now." Thomas didn't hold grudges. He had spent his life leading people, and he knew that sometimes people needed moments like this to grow. "What matters is what you do next," he said simply. "We all make mistakes. It's what we learn from them that counts." The woman sat silently for a moment, his words sinking in. Then she straightened her posture and gave a small nod. "You're right," she said. "I'll remember that." Thomas gave her a brief, respectful nod before turning back toward the window. The conversation was over, but its impact lingered. The woman no longer carried the same attitude she had before. Instead, she seemed to be reflecting on her actions, perhaps realizing that respect was not about wealth, status, or appearance, but about character. The plane continued its journey, soaring through the sky, and as the clouds passed by, the woman remained quiet, lost in thought, as if seeing the world a little differently than before. The flight had settled into a quiet rhythm. The passengers were either reading, watching movies, or resting. The woman beside Admiral Thomas had stopped fidgeting. Instead, she sat still, occasionally glancing his way, as if trying to understand the kind of man he was. After a while, the flight attendants came through the cabin with meal service. "Sir, would you like the chicken or pasta?" A flight attendant asked Thomas politely. "Chicken, please," he replied with a small nod. She then turned to the woman. "And for you, ma'am." "Pasta," the woman answered, her voice softer than before. As the attendants moved on, she cleared her throat and turned slightly toward Thomas. "So, how long have you been in the Navy?" she asked hesitantly, as if unsure whether he would even want to talk to her. Thomas looked at her, studying her expression. He could tell this wasn't just a meaningless question. She was trying to understand, maybe even make up for how she had acted earlier. "Over 30 years, he said simply. Her eyebrows lifted slightly. "Wow, that's a long time," she said. "You must have seen a lot." Thomas gave a small nod. "I have." The woman hesitated, then spoke again. "I've never met an admiral before. I didn't even know much about what they do." Thomas wasn't surprised. "Most people don't," he said. "And that's okay. We do our job so that others don't have to worry about it." She nodded slowly, considering his words. "I guess I never really thought about that," she admitted. Thomas took a sip of water before continuing. "Leadership in the Navy isn't about power, it's about responsibility. You don't earn respect by demanding it. You earn it by how you treat others and the choices you make." The woman lowered her gaze, clearly thinking about his words. She had spent the entire beginning of the flight acting, as if she were more important than others. But now she was sitting next to someone who had spent decades serving his country with quiet strength. After a moment, she sighed. "You must think I'm a terrible person," she said, giving a small, embarrassed smile. Thomas shook his head. "No," he said simply, "just someone who made a mistake." She looked at him, surprised by his kindness. "You're a lot more patient than I would be," she admitted. Thomas gave a slight smile. "Patience is something you learn when you've been through enough." The woman nodded, seeming to understand. "I appreciate you not holding it against me," she said sincerely. He nodded again, and the conversation settled into a comfortable silence. The flight continued smoothly, and for the first time since boarding, the woman looked relaxed. She had come onto this plane thinking she knew everything. But now she was leaving with a new perspective, one that she would carry with her long after the flight had landed. The flight continued smoothly as the passengers finished their meals. The woman beside Admiral Thomas had changed. Her posture was no longer tense, and her expression, once full of frustration, now carried a hint of humility. She had come onto this flight thinking she understood the world, but now she realized she still had a lot to learn. After the trays were cleared, the cabin lights dimmed slightly to allow passengers to rest. Thomas leaned back in his seat, closing his eyes for a moment. His years of service had taught him to appreciate quiet moments, no matter how brief. The woman, however, was still awake. She kept glancing at him as if she had one last thing to say but wasn't sure if she should. Finally, after a few minutes, she took a deep breath and spoke. "Can I ask you something?" she said in a respectful tone, very different from before. Thomas opened his eyes and looked at her. "Go ahead." She hesitated. "Have you ever dealt with people like me before?" Thomas let out a quiet chuckle. "More times than I can count," he admitted. The woman gave a small, sheepish smile. "And what do you normally do?" Thomas thought for a moment before answering. "I listen. I let them speak, and when the time is right, I show them who I really am, not with words, but with actions. She nodded slowly, understanding what he meant. I guess I really messed up, didn't I? Thomas gave a small, reassuring smile. You learned something today. That's what matters. She exhaled and looked down at her hands. I did, she admitted. And I won't forget it. The pilot's voice suddenly came over the intercom, announcing the plane's descent. Passengers stirred, adjusting their seats and preparing for landing. The woman looked out the window, lost in thought. As the plane touched down smoothly on the runway, Thomas remained calm, his hands resting lightly on the armrests. The woman, however, seemed different from the person who had first boarded the plane. She had arrived with a sense of entitlement, but now she was leaving with something far more valuable: understanding. As the aircraft taxied toward the gate, she turned to Thomas one last time. I never got your full name, she said. Admiral James Thomas, he said simply. She extended her hand hesitantly. It was an honor meeting you, Admiral Thomas. Thomas shook her hand firmly, giving a small nod. Safe travels. The plane came to a stop, and passengers began gathering their belongings. As Thomas stood, a few people nearby gave him respectful nods, having witnessed the events of the flight. The woman, now quiet but thoughtful, watched as he walked toward the exit. She had boarded that plane with one perspective, but she was leaving with a new one that would change the way she treated people from that day forward.